Hello, dear listener, and welcome back to the Psychosynthesis Sessions, which is, where are we now? We're in Season 1, Episode 4? 4, yeah. So myself and my good friend Ryan O'Kane are going to be continuing our conversation about psychosynthesis, what it is, how to do it, based upon my recent book, The Act of Imagination, Psychosynthesis Psychotherapy in Experiential Context. If people watching the video will know that Ryan is pointing to said book, and people in the audio
won't know.
Will now know about that because I've told them. But what in particular are we talking about today, Ryan?
Well, okay, so we're on episode 4, but chapter 3 of your book, titled Influences. So the influences on psychosynthesis. And I think it'd be useful. Could you give a bit of context about this chapter? Because in some ways it's not immediately straightforwardly obvious why this is important, I think. So I was curious if you can say a little bit about, I'm guessing that there's some misunderstandings about the influences on psychosynthesis you would like to address. So that's, so maybe tell us a bit about why you wrote this chapter.
Good guess. Well, I think, there's a few things. I think the top line is that if we want to understand what psychosynthesis is, probably the missing link is understanding the influences that psychosynthesis is informed by, past, present and future. Often when we've discussed this already in earlier parts. We've discussed the teachings of psychosynthesis, we've discussed the techniques of psychosynthesis. Those are the two things that people usually go to find out what psychosynthesis is. The influences tend to be neglected or dealt with kind of around the edges. But it seems to me that it's really, really important to understand what the influences are. Not so much what they are, but how they're being used. So when I was learning to be a psychosynthesis psychotherapist, there was a sort of koan, there was a sort of like debate. Is psychosynthesis a scientific psychology? Or is it esoteric, mystical tradition or practice or something like that? And that speaks to the tension within psychosynthesis and its history. Because Assagioli presented psychosynthesis as a science, as indeed most people writing about psychology, psychotherapy at the time were doing, early to mid 20th century. That was the dream, and I write about the dream of a science in this chapter in the book.
I really like that phrase.
The dream of a science. So it's like Assagioli dreamt up psychosynthesis as a science.
Mm-hmm.
He positioned it as scientific. He wanted people to understand it was, legitimate. And indeed, I think that did give it legitimacy in the culture of the day, to say that it was scientific. And he called that his exoteric presentation. So exoteric meaning, what does that mean? Visible, external. So, but he also had what he called the esoteric papers. So he was informed by lots of non-scientific influences. So the scientific influences, his medical training, his studies in psychiatry, arguably psychoanalysis, which Freud positioned also as a science. So the medical model, empiricism, these are strong influences upon Assagioli. which kind of get taken for granted, and we'll talk more, but I think they do lead to something of a dream cast upon psychosynthesis, because it's kind of so, that scientific influence is so embedded, you can see it so strongly all the way through Assagioli's presentation of psychosynthesis anyway, that it kind of gets missed because it's just assumed to be what psychosynthesis is. And then there's the non-scientific influences. So famously, he was well versed in various religions, East and West, esoteric practices and philosophies, East and West. He was hanging out with all sorts of interesting characters, exploring various things, and he drew upon that. And you can see those influences in psychosynthesis as well. So you've got there's the famous disidentification exercise where you explore your body, your feelings, your mind. You can see the foundations of mindfulness there from the Buddhist tradition. Empirical science. No, we'll talk about that later. I'm jumping ahead. Another one would be Kabbalah, Jewish Kabbalah. So the I-self relationship. You can see that the I-self relationship reflects the Kabbalah religion. All sorts of things are in there, but he hid them from his exoteric presentation behind what he called a wall of silence.
Yeah.
And the normal explanation for that is that he wanted to maintain legitimacy for his science-based project. So I talk all this through in the book, and we'll get into it in this episode. The long and short of it is, for a headline and an introduction to this episode, is that because he was hiding his influences, he didn't particularly say very much about how to apply influences or what he was doing with these influences that made them psychosynthesis. And I think that's the question that I explore and offer an answer to in the chapter, so that contemporary psychosynthesis practitioners can have because we're drawing on influences from, maybe similar ones to what Assagioli drew upon, but also other influences that he didn't draw upon, because we live in a different world. So we've all had our own personal experience. We draw upon that as an influence. What do we do with these influences that makes what we do psychosynthesis, rather than just doing these influences? What is it that turns these influences into psychosynthesis? And by and large, that's the implicit modus operandi that we've spoken about in earlier episodes. There's a sort of culture or a way of being in psychosynthesis that gets passed on implicitly, like unconsciously, as a culture, from teacher to student, therapist to client, but it's not actually articulated or made explicit. And so I was at pains in this episode to do that. I mean, the last strand, by way of introduction, is that one of the psychosynthesis sort of cliches is a bit pejorative, but it is. It's like, you need to learn how to do psychosynthesis your way. That is the invitation that I heard again and again and again during my psychosynthesis training, which always intrigued me. And I was like, oh, that's exciting. Mm-hmm. That means I can, take some responsibility and do it my way. But where I got to with that is that, there's something that I needed to do to make it my own. And I wasn't just going to receive it from what was written down in books or what other people did or told me. There was something that I needed to do. And I think that what you need to do is connected to influences. Because when you say you make it your own, you are drawing upon a set of influences and life experiences. How do you turn them into psychosynthesis? What is it that makes them psychosynthesis? So that's why it's important, I think.
That's interesting. Yeah, I suppose it. I've always seen psychosynthesis as kind of like it's an integrative kind of an integrative system, but has an explicit framework for that. Whereas a lot of integrative therapists, they don't have an explicit system. They don't have a kind of a framework for how to integrate, but their influences are there on the table. You know, it's like here's the set of influence. I touched my mic there. Did you hear that? A little
Need
bit.
to learn to not do that. Yeah.
It's gesticulating, and
You're getting excited with your hands.
yeah. So yeah, what I notice is that a lot of integrative therapists, they can cherry pick from lots of different places, but there's not really a kind of core to bring coherence to how you integrate and whether things are compatible or not, or all of that kind of stuff. Whereas what I'm hearing from what you're saying is that we have the integrating framework, but in order to make the integrating framework work, Assagioli's strategy was the wall of silence. Was so that people didn't get hung up on all those sources and bits. He's kind of done the translation, and we've got to go along with that translation. But what that has left, I think, it's left a lot of legacy in psychosynthesis. One of them, I think, is just a kind of confusion and slight suspicion. I mean, the wall of silence sounds a bit sinister. You know, it's like, well, why? What's going on there?
It's
why
a bit
aren't we
mean,
talking about that? Which comes through in a lot of student curiosity about that. And we also live in a time where that original, I don't know, the conventional explanation that it was about legitimacy is not so important anymore. It doesn't seem so important, or at least within our wider field, there's space to talk about those influences. So you're kind of opening up that space.
Nice. I think that's right about the integrative approach. I think because on some trainings to learn to be a therapist, you'll do 3 months on person-centered work, 3 months on Gestalt, 3 months on psychodynamic, and that's great because then you learn these 3 different philosophies or approaches and practices. I never got that when I was training to be a psychosynthesis therapist. We were always, we'd turn up on a seminar and we didn't quite know what influences were going to be thrown at us. The great thing was that we did have this psychosynthesis understanding that we always related them back to. So no matter what influence the trainer would talk about, we all have a shared psychosynthesis understanding to some extent that it was kind of woven into. And yet, again, like I say, that was it could be done more clearly, and that's what I've set out to do in the book. The second point that comes up from what you say is that the wall of silence. Yeah, it does provoke negative responses. It's a sort of in-group, out-group. Why aren't we not in the inside behind the wall with all the cool kids reading all this stuff about Sufism or whatever it is? So maybe a nice way to go forwards for now would be to explain like 2 ways in which you can understand the reason for that wall of silence, because I've only mentioned one of them, the typical understanding, and that has several limitations, well 3 that I can see. And then the exciting thing to get into would be the second reason for having a wall of silence, which might lead us then into understanding or proposing how you translate an influence into psychosynthesis theory.
Yeah, great. I in my notes I made an error.
Oh yeah.
A spelling, a typo, and I put the wall of science. The wall of science. I don't know.
A Freudian typo.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, well, maybe just let's touch on the dream of a science thing. I mean, in some senses, psychosynthesis is a science, but you need to address what Assagioli means by a science and what he doesn't mean. In large part, what he means by a science. Let's back up a little bit. I mean, basically, there's physicists, there's biologists, there's chemists. They created this technological world. And at that time, the dream was that therapists, psychologists would similarly do the same for the psychological world. So they saw themselves as internalizing the approach of the empirical scientists. So they weren't observing like the planets crossing the sky. They were observing feelings and thoughts, and their argument was that these were equally empirical because they were an experience. So you see the experiential emphasis there in some of those assumptions. So even though you can't actually get a telescope and look at your feelings like they can with planets in the sky, even though you can't weigh your feelings on a scale or measure them with a ruler, they were thinking they could nevertheless take this empirical approach and apply it to quote-unquote inner experiences or subjective experiences. So that's the first thing. That doesn't sound very dreamy. That's kind of like, this is your experience. That's quite sort of waking reality. The other thing that he says about science, which is quite interesting, is that he's quite clear that while it might be desirable one day to have established a scientific understanding of psychosynthesis, of the self, of the energies of the self, he's very clear that that's not happened. He's not done that. He's very clear that he's very much in the early stages of experimentation and field study, he says. But then he goes further and he says, but even if one day we did have a scientific understanding of the self and the energies of the self and that would not discount the importance of continuing to investigate the experience. And I think that's really cool as well, because that's genuinely scientific. Because contrary to what you get from politicians when they say, like, let's follow the science, actual science isn't about this is what's true. Remember, we started with that back in the first episode. Actual science is like, this is what we think's what's true based on our current understanding. It's a hypothesis. It might change as further investigations go forwards. So I think that's a lovely experiential emphasis again, and also another piece of evidence that Assagioli's treating any kind of theoretical framework very tentatively and very lightly, and he's in many ways avoidant of pinning things down to a dogma. But there is a dreamer aspect to science, which we'll get to. We'll put a pin in the map and we'll come back to that later, because I think we need to talk about the non-scientific influences first. So the wall of silence, two reasons for that. First of which, as we've mentioned already, is the legitimacy that you get from saying that you're a scientific psychology. But as you said, Ryan, we don't need to pretend that anymore, because the world's changed and we're now living in a quantum world where very mysterious things happen and get spoken about on the 9 o'clock news, and people spend billions of pounds on those, what they call those hadron collider things, to smash particles against each other. And so we've moved on, and some of these new sciences seem quite similar to mystical traditions and soulfulness and all these earlier traditions in a way. Contemporary science has become so crazy that it's like looping back to these like pre-scientific worldviews and traditions. So that opens up some possibilities, because one of the responses to that is to think, well, now we can go back and find out the influences that Assagioli drew upon, and we can find out what psychosynthesis would really have looked like if we'd lived in this alternative history where he didn't have to hide where he was coming from.
Right.
And we can present a sort of soaked up, like, fuller psychosynthesis or something like that. And so there's three problems with that that I've come up with anyway. The first of which is that, well, if you're looking back into history, I mean, you weren't around when the Buddha was around, right? You don't know what Buddhism was like 2,000 years ago, or why they were doing it. You've got ideas about that, but the ideas that we have about the past are filtered through the assumptions of the present. So there's always an interpretive leap when we go back into the past. And you see that in the history of ideas, how our understanding of the past has changed. Partly because we get more information, but also because we kind of change our assumptions. And so what I'm saying is how Assagioli understood influence X from the past might be different to how we now understand it now. And also his understanding of that influence from the past wasn't the original understanding. Well, so it's always on the move, right?
Yeah. I mean, especially, theosophy is a big part of those influences, but it was also the vehicle by which Assagioli and many others through that gained access to Hinduism.
Right.
But it was seen through the lens of theosophy, and so is maybe
I see. So
Hinduism.
It's a theosophical take on Hinduism.
Yeah. There's a whole tangent there, actually. But
no, this is why it's great to have you as a co-host, because this is like your wheelhouse in a way. This is one of the topics that you teach.
Well, it's become so more recently, yeah. But no, I mean, I won't follow the tangent, but just to kind of give you a flag towards it, is that Gandhi discovered Hinduism through theosophy.
Weird.
Yeah. So there's this kind of, the historical context and the kind of lens through which you see these traditions, is always different. So I completely agree, and going to have some really weird consequences as well, like that. Anyway.
So that's a great example. So that's mad. So Gandhi, through his Western education, as it were, discovered theosophy, which is a Western
because he'd
phenomenon.
been brought up originally in the under Empire, where Hinduism was suppressed as a kind of manifestation of the devil in some way, at some more extreme teachings. So imperialism suppressed it, but then other Western forces through theosophy introduced him to it again. So,
That's a great sidebar. I like that. So the summary point now for this danger is that psychosynthesis arguably has and always will be influenced by influences that are changing, and as soon as you try to pin them down in a sort of decontextualized ahistorical fashion, you've lost that dynamic element, and you're moving towards an ossification. You're in danger of saying it is this. This is the real psychosynthesis. But the second and related danger is that you cherry pick one or two or three or a handful of influences. Obviously, Assagioli was steeped in a diversity of influences. So many influences that it's impossible to number them. He had a long life. He had a massive library. He travelled widely. He spoke to the leading figures in various fields. He corresponded. He wrote letters. He had personal conversations. And he lived through the 20th century, which was just like masses of changes and influences, technological, societal, cultural, wars, etc. All these things influenced Assagioli and arguably influenced how he formulated psychosynthesis.
Alan,
yeah.
I mean, stop me. It's
No,
another potential.
Yeah, go for it. Another one. Good.
But I think it's important in terms of the esoteric stuff. Because what you're talking about, I mean, what's coming up in my mind is the perennial truth. Okay, and when you look at Assagioli's quest throughout all of those traditions were also really complex and syncretistic. Syncretistic. So theosophy itself was a kind of amalgam of loads of different traditions brought together.
Yes, right.
All of that. But I think there's this kind of quest for a perennial truth that seems to be perfect. And I know, the idea of a perennial truth is that actually experience is at the core, and every spiritual tradition is trying to express the same experience, but in different language. So although it looks like loads of different traditions all being amalgamated, there was something going on, I think, especially for Assagioli, of trying to find things that resonated with that experience. That's. But the other thing that comes up is this thing about when you're saying that there's this kind of attempt to go back beyond the wall of science and find the true, what would have happened if that wall of science hadn't been there, and the true psychosynthesis. I think that's quite a common theme within spiritual traditions, especially those sort of especially esoteric traditions, that there is this belief in a golden, original source wisdom, that perennial wisdom. And I think that's kind of where that perennial thing can diverge, in that there's an understanding of perennial wisdom, which is, this is all about my experience. This is all about reminding me that I'm the source of truth, and I have to go into its inner wisdom. And then there's a kind of a detour, an unhelpful detour on the perennial path, which is believing that there is some golden original external wisdom that everyone is drawing from, or if you go back far enough in the tradition, you will find
an objective truth, the real truth, the one truth.
So I think that what you're talking about is an expression of something quite ancient, actually. You're identifying that point in the road, that diversion between experience and going down some
seeking the real dogma, basically.
Yeah, the red herring or the wild goose chase or whatever. Yeah,
so I mean, I guess in those terms, Assagioli, we could say, would be emphasizing the experiential truth, and he's resisting pinning it down. But just to finish that point, I mean, even if we could gather all the different influences that influenced him and weighted them accordingly, even if you could do that, how they come together in synthesis, how they interrelate, I mean, that's hugely complex and impossible to argue even or establish. And there's a really nice footnote in the book with a long quote from Piero Ferrucci, who's one of Assagioli's early students, who's done a lot of work, and people in psychosynthesis world will know who Piero Ferrucci is. And he's got a quote of him saying that, it's kind of mad to think that, why would Assagioli have spent his whole life creating this thing called psychosynthesis and going to all the trouble of writing papers and books and opening up centres and travelling, if really all he was doing was a sort of watered down version of some esoteric truth. And I think that's just a really good point. But I just sort of reverse engineered that point that Ferrucci made, just to point out the sort of ridiculousness of assuming that we can nail down not the watered down truth, but the thing that has been diluted from, as it were. The third one, though, speaks to this perennial philosophy. The third problem with the get into the real thing behind the wall of science. The third problem is that you end up attributing psychosynthesis to a particular philosophical doctrine, metaphysical system, or religion. And that runs against the distinctiveness of psychosynthesis, at least in Assagioli's presentation, because he is at pains throughout his presentation, and I quote him 4 or 5 times saying the same thing in different ways, which is that psychosynthesis is not a philosophy. Psychosynthesis is not offering a metaphysical framework, even of a scientific kind. And he famously says that it takes us to the door of the mystery, but leaves us there. It doesn't purport to explain away the mystery. It doesn't make propositional claims about reality, and therefore, if you're saying that psychosynthesis is really blah 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 philosophy, then all these philosophies, in my understanding, do indeed make propositional claims about reality. So, for example, the perennial philosophy that you've just mentioned there, on that side of looking for the one truth, that's a propositional claim about reality, that there is a one truth, there is a real universal truth that's there behind all these veils, that all the different religions in the world are pointing to. Maybe. But how do you know? Has anyone been there? Has anyone had that and come back and shown their holiday photographs? That's a belief system, that's a philosophy. It might be useful for us. We might learn things from drawing upon it. And it's not wrong, therefore. But I'm arguing that we need to stop short at equating that influence with psychosynthesis theory and psychosynthesis practice. We can draw upon influences, but when we spill over into saying that psychosynthesis is an expression of, for example, the perennial philosophy, then I think something's being lost there. Because I really like the rigor that Assagioli has of saying that it takes us to the door of the mystery, because in my book that means that he allows us to exist between theory and experience. He doesn't conflate them. He's allowing us to hypothesize with theories on experience, but always recognizing that these philosophies, these theories are abstractions. They're not the truth. They're not your experience. And it's really, really important to distinguish the two.
I get a bit stuck on this bit. Do you mind if I...
Of course not. Go for it. Let's
a little bit. I don't think it's within anyone's capacity to prevent a body of thought from becoming a philosophy, or from being received as a philosophy, so I don't think psychosynthesis is that much different from any other system of thought in that sense, in that it's just, it's a story at the end of the day, and you can believe that story or not. I think what you're pointing to, and also, so we can remind the reader or the student as often as we like that this needs to be, that to not hold those concepts as reality.
You're smashing your microphone again.
To not hold those concepts as reality, and to, as you say, keep reminding them that this is about experience, not the propositional claims about reality.
Yes.
But it'll happen, and and it's something to do with language as well, the limits of language, I think, that are there. So I suppose I see it more as a noble endeavour
I,
rather than.
there's always a belief system. You can't get away from having beliefs. So I'm not saying psychosynthesis isn't that. What I am saying is that it's at best a belief system that is suspicious of belief systems.
Fair enough. Yeah.
And we need to, whatever our belief system, to hold them lightly. You can't not have them because they're there structuring your experience and your reality all the time. So it's and that's a nuanced position to navigate.
Yes, but it's also you've got to kind of.
But I think the best way of maybe opening up that nuanced position is to say, I think it's on it's the task of those people who say that their philosophy is true to bring in the evidence. It's not my position to prove that being suspicious of belief systems is true. I think it's on the people who say, no, this is the way reality is, to show me the receipts. And I don't think they're going to be able to do that.
No, I agree. But is it not also the responsibility of the person reminding people that this is not the truth?
Yes.
Not to then fall into the same pitfalls you're trying to.
Absolutely.
Which isn't that's the kind of core of part.
That's the irony of paying lip service to this is not the truth, because we sort of say this isn't the truth, and then we sort of talk about it as if it's the only way.
But even Assagioli.
When it absolutely. Whenever you fall into one way of thinking about something, and you don't have an alternative way of thinking about it or working with it, it ends up becoming the truth, because it becomes a literal
habit. Almost.
So that's how I start the book, because it's very difficult not to fall into that. Because when you say, childhood wounding is the cause of, blah, that's just a hypothesis about your psychological suffering. But if you don't have an alternative framework and a different belief system to understand what might be causing your psychological suffering, or what your psychological suffering is for, then you will believe that it's being caused by what happened to you in childhood, and you'll forget that's it might not be wrong, but it needs to be held sensitively, because there's lots of other things causing you psychological distress, the whole philosophy of the unconscious and how that gets taken literally, and people think there is a place called the unconscious where their repressed traumas are, like a book on a shelf in a library. That's a story, as you say. It's a belief system about the unconscious, which is useful to think about our experience. But again, no one's actually been to the unconscious and come back and showed their holiday pictures. So it is very easy to forget that. But I think this maybe leads into the next thing that Assagioli does, because he also explains that another reason for the wall of silence being employed, which isn't so much about silence, it isn't so much about pretending to be a scientific tradition rather than and hiding your esoteric traditions. It's nothing to do with that in this regard. He sees the wall of silence as a process of translation. So he has these influences, and it's like the wall of silence is porous, and it's like he filters them through the wall of silence. And when they pass through the other side, they've been translated into a language applicable to the person that he's talking to, or the client if you're a psychotherapist. Because when the client comes to therapy, they're not wanting a philosophical debate, they're not wanting a religious sermon, they're not even wanting to learn about psychological theory and the higher self this and the personal self that and the ideal model and the disidentification. They want you to understand their suffering and help them with it. So he there's some really juicy quotes in this chapter where he quite playfully says there's no theory in psychosynthesis, anything but. And he says, to paraphrase, he says, we need to use our psychological theories and use our thoughts, and we can think better and more fully, and we all need to think better. But we need to remember that these are just symbols, and symbols are not experiences. And if we want to pass through to the experience, we need to recognize that these concepts, these philosophies, are just symbols. So and that was really exciting for me to sort of get my head around that, because for a long time I'd been working as a therapist without using any psychological jargon. I would never talk to my clients about a subpersonality or a disidentification or the higher self. That was for me. That was my framework, if you like. That was my belief system. But when I talk to the client, I would just be using normal, everyday, descriptive language.
But can I ask, is that something you felt that you were trained, you were expected to be using that language to be a psychosynthesis therapist?
I was never taught explicitly one way or the other. But I first recognised that you could have a choice when I was doing my dissertation for my master's on the psychotherapy training, and I interviewed some quite experienced psychosynthesis psychotherapists, and some of them used the language. Some of them spoke about subpersonalities and the will or disidentification with their clients, and others, intriguingly, at the time they didn't do that, and they did that for a reason. And the reason that I've just given you, that was the reason that they gave me at the time. They'd learned that they didn't need to do psychosynthesis by articulating the theory of psychosynthesis. The former group were using those. I guess maybe they just hadn't thought about it. And it's not wrong to talk about disidentification and subpersonalities, but I would argue that the danger is that you end up, because it's a theory system, you end up sort of thinking about or explaining the client's experience in respect to whatever theory that you're using. Whereas to get into the experience, this experiential underbelly, requires a more refined, almost artistic language, a descriptive language that meets the client where they are without any sort of cognitive layering. That's where that came from for me, from just what people did.
Yeah. You also see it with I always struck me that there's a big difference between like training therapy, the experience of training therapy, and therapy in the real world, let's say, because the student clients come with that framework in their head already.
Yeah, I know. Yeah. Yes, it's a tricky one. Exactly. So when you meet real clients, they've not been sort of like schooled in this lexicon of terminology. They don't talk like that. I remember trying to convince a client that they had these different parts of themselves. That was another turning point for me, actually. And this woman was having none of it. She was like, "That's weird. That doesn't make sense to me. What are you on about?" And at the time, I was like, "Oh no. She's really identified. She's really concrete thinking." And I spent a lot of time trying to convince her of my belief system, because I was using the mind as machine metaphor in different parts of you that we spoke about. That was in the last episode, at the end of the last episode. She was having none of it. But I think looking back, I feel a bit bad about that, because I was forcing onto her one way of thinking about things. These days I'd be quite happy to. I mean, I don't talk about parts. That's another sort of theoretical frame that I resist. I might think about parts, and I might at times talk to clients about parts, but for long parts of the session, not. So where have we got to? So that's the three sort of downsides of trying to find the origin story of psychosynthesis. You end up focusing on a dynamic influence in an ahistorical fashion. You sort of freeze frame it and say this is what the influence is. You miss out on the fact that there's a diversity of influences, so it's not just one or two. There's like a lot of influences that have shaped Assagioli's life and how he formulated psychosynthesis. And hey, it's the same for all of us, because that's where we're about to go. It's not just Assagioli that had lots of influences acting upon us. Him, everybody does.
Mm-hmm.
And what do we do with them? And the third one is that you're in danger of attributing a particular philosophy or belief system or metaphysics or religion, even a scientific one, as what psychosynthesis is, when that sort of undermines the experiential emphasis that runs through the whole project. And the alternative is to not use, to see it as a translation of that language into experiential language. But then we've not really spoken about, that doesn't help you with regards to how you use influences to inform your psychosynthesis theory. If you see what I mean.
To make it your own.
Yeah, or even just what Assagioli does. So it's like how you talk to the client. So there's a theory experience gap. And now what I'm talking about is the theory influence gap. So you've got an influence that shapes a theory, and then the theory speaks to the experience. Are you with me? Is that?
I'm with you. Yeah.
Yeah. So what do we do with these influences that means what we do with them is psychosynthesis? That's the $1 million question. That's the unanswered question that got me started on this chapter. That's what we were talking about. So,
and then I think in the chapter you come to, because we parked the dream of science.
Yeah.
So should we come back to that as?
Yeah, they can do both of them together. Yeah. So, in the book, what I do is I propose 3 sub-principles. So remember, in the book, we're tracking the twin principles of experience and synthesis. And my argument is that that's the principial, the basic principles, the root principles that underpin what makes psychosynthesis. It's a process of gathering together elements into a greater whole. That's what synthesis is. And that's an experience that's happening psychologically. It's not an abstract idea. There's abstract ideas about it, but it's an experience. So what I propose, what I introduce in this chapter are 3 sub-principles. If I can remember them: holistic, perspectival, and emergent. Holistic, perspectival, and emergent. And the influence for that, because there's always an influence, is from systems theory. So these are characteristics of systems, which I talk about in chapter 1. But in brief, systems theory, I mean, you know more about it than me, but systems theory is a way of understanding synthesis, basically, and networks of relationships between interconnected parts. So if we're thinking about the psyche as a system, which has multiple elements and networked together in multiple relationships, and we're working to help it move towards synthesis, which is what Assagioli says it wants to do, and suffering comes about as when that process gets interrupted or blocked for whatever reason, then systems theory is quite helpful. So there's a little footnote about that if people want to read further, but let's just run with it for now. So holistic. So do interject as I go through if anything comes up for you. But the holistic sub-principle basically rests upon the fact that for psychosynthesis, everything's interconnected. Everything's joined up. There's no separation. Obviously you get stuck, you get identified, but that's more like a sort of psychological separation than an actual separation. So we're always working with the whole in that case. And there's a few quotes that I bring in that Assagioli says. We always have to relate the part to the whole. And we always want to think about the whole. We never want to just get lost in working with the part. Because they're all interconnected. Yeah.
Just to maybe highlight what you've already said in other parts, but just to make it distinct here, I think. Because if we're just talking about parts and wholes and systems, unless we introduce the kind of the word something like dynamic into that, or process, then we could find ourselves in more mechanistic views of a system. But the important part, as you've already said in other parts of the book, is that this is a dynamic system, it's a changing system.
Yes.
Processes that we're talking about here,
not static at all. No, it's always moving, and trying to figure out the best configuration to meet the current situation. So we're always relating the parts to the whole. Nothing's isolated. Now, let's come back to the dreamier aspects of psychosynthesis as a science, and we'll use empirical science as our test case. So empirical science is, Assagioli talks about natural science and empirical science, and so basically the empirical science, simplest way of understanding it is that an empirical scientist is one who wants to observe the world as accurately or as objectively as possible, take measurements to create a hypothesis that then allows him to control that world. And that's great if you're building airplanes or steam engines or bridges. And as we've said, Assagioli sort of internalized that, and he pictures the I, he calls the I, the center of consciousness and will, as analogous to that natural scientist. So he writes about the observer. That's why the I is synonymous with the observer, because it's like a scientific observer. And he writes about it in a fairly objective. He sort of tells the story that this I can observe psychological life objectively.
Yeah.
Which is what the empirical scientist is trying to do when he's observing his plants and his planets and stuff, to remove the subjective bias of the scientist, to get accurate measurements. Now, even the empirical scientist isn't completely separate from his observations. They'll always be shaped by some kind of subjective bias or influence. All you can do is methodologically minimize that. But Assagioli doesn't even allow for that. He posits that the I is separate, unchanging, eternal, above him, above the flow of experience. So in that sense, I argue that you're not working holistically, because you've sort of separated off this I position and said that it's not contingent upon what's going on around it.
To be fair to him,
let's be fair. That's fair enough.
Everyone else at the time was doing the same thing.
Yeah.
It's really interesting, that period, I think, when he was writing, because there's a dualism in Western thought that goes back a long way, but was articulated by Descartes, that object-subject division. And it was this uneasy truce, in a way, between religion and science. So religion could have its space of it that was separate to analysis from science, and therefore science could have a position, like the scientist could have a position to analyze and test and whatever. And spirituality never got investigated. The spiritual mind never got investigated. But that collapsed with Darwin,
Mm.
So Assagioli, Freud, they're all writing in this post-Darwinian, the world's being turned upside down, or that truce between object and subject being turned upside down, and yet there was still a clinging, and it still persists today. I think. I mean, we talk about quantum physics and stuff, but it's still seen as a quite niche in a way, in terms of the whole scientific. If you look at the structure of science, it's still fairly positivist. Especially even in mental health, where medicine is the solution and all that. But he'd broken that barrier, like Freud and Assagioli did, of like, no, we are going to look scientifically at ourselves, at the psyche, at experience, and yet to do so, we're still holding on to this idea that there is this privileged space to do that from. So there's a kind of contradiction in that. So there's that wider context, but I suppose I also wonder on a psychological level. I don't know. I mean, we don't know that much about Assagioli, but if you think about, like, really, in terms of his biography, it's quite sparse, and getting to know the person is quite difficult. But if you compare with someone like Jung and their explorations and their attitudes to the self, I don't know. There's something I feel a bit like protective about the concept of this personal self, this concrete personal self. It's like there's a reluctance there to jump into this messy world where there isn't a firm place to stand from, and kind of a preservation of something a bit conservative.
Somebody was reading my book and giving me feedback on it the other day, and he said, it's a bit trippy, Alan. and I was really flattered by that, because I think that speaks to what you've just said. Because, like, if you take away this objective observer center of consciousness and control, consciousness and will, which is exactly what I do, certainly in the next chapter that we talk about next time, and then decenter the experience of self, it is a bit trippy. I mean, but for now, just to finish on holistic, it's not like that empirical influence is wrong. You could argue that it does feel like sometimes we can observe our experience, and that we have a sort of perspective on it analogous to a scientist observing the passing experiences in the world. So there is an overlap there, but all I'm saying is it's just a metaphor. And when that metaphorical aspect is forgotten, then the influence becomes the theory, and then we have a belief system that we have this I, and then we spend a lot of time looking for our I, and trying to, like, build up our I, and yet, I don't know, I feel very heterodox and on thin ice saying this, because it is such an assumption within psychosynthesis theory. But increasingly, and I still teach it because it is there in part of the history, but I take it quite lightly, the idea of a personal I. I really, because I've never found my I. And it has some dangers, which is what we're going to get into in the next one. So the next sub-principle is perspectival. So given that a dynamic system is holistic, wherever you experience that system from will be a particular perspective. You will not be able to experience the whole of the system or from any one position, because there's stuff going on behind your head, as it were, and you will have a particular vantage point on the system that will be different from other places in the system. Now, again, if we come back to the scientific observer, that fantasy, if you like, of the empirical scientist who makes accurate observations of what is happening, sort of strips out the fact that there is a perspective, there is a sort of valuation process that's happening, a meaning making that's happening between the scientist and the world. And Assagioli goes both ways, as he often does, and as I show throughout the book. So in some places he talks about the I, this observer position, as being able to objectively notice what is happening. In other words, it's not a perspective, it's an accurate, objective perspective. And he talks about the need to do that. Which
he uses really kind of concrete language. I was quite shocked by some of the quotes you pulled out that I hadn't read.
Yeah.
There's quite a lot, like a God perspective almost, that comes through it. It's like there's a phrase, he uses the word one, like one can then, but I replaced it with, if you replace it with the word I, it's quite like, I can then at will, at any moment, disidentify from any overpowering emotion, annoying thought, inappropriate role, etc., and from the vantage point of the detached observer, gain a clearer understanding of the situation, its meaning, its causes, and the most effective way to deal with it. I mean, it's a detached observer. A lot of there's kind of some hubris in there. Yeah. I think
we must employ cold, impersonal observation, as if they were natural, as if they were mere natural phenomena occurring outside ourselves. We should create a psychological distance between ourselves and them, i.e., our feelings and thoughts and stuff. So the obvious danger there is that you end up sort of getting a bit alienated from yourself. You create this distance from your experience. You're always trying to sort of get ahead of yourself. You're always trying to sort of step out or step back, which is a common sort of phrase in psychosynthesis. You get it in a lot of student essays. They see disidentification as a sort of stepping back.
Well, he uses that language himself. So
Exactly. So,
can I ask? Sorry, Alan.
Go on.
I mean, this is a potential tangent, obviously.
We like your tangents.
Right. But at this, obviously, Furman and Gieler. This is John Furman and Ann Gieler made an amazing critical contribution to psychosynthesis in the 90s with the primal group. Well, from earlier actually, but it's one of their best kind of summaries. And I mean, I think this dualism within psychosynthesis was one of their central concerns. So, how successful do you think they were in addressing this kind of...
Oh, that's a good question. I think they ran with it quite far, but they didn't go all the way, because they remained tied to the language of the unconscious and Assagioli's presentation of psychosynthesis. So they maintained a theory of the I as a centre of consciousness and will, which I think holds up that project to some extent. So I ran with a line from Molly Young Brown, who wrote the foreword to the book, and I read this. It's just like a little paragraph that she wrote. And I read this very early on in even just thinking about writing this book, and I thought, that's what I want to write about. And in some ways, this book is just a big excuse to quote that at the end of chapter 4, because she says, might as well read it out properly, give her the respect that she's due. If I can find it quickly. Here we go. So this is Molly Young Brown speaking, okay? A subsystem may specialize to perform needed functions of coordination, but we would hardly say the nervous system is the boss of our body. It simply carries messages around about what is happening elsewhere and what responses are required. In psychosynthesis, we might see the self and the will as the boss of the system, but I believe this is a distortion arising from our cultural bias towards hierarchy. The self is the system, and the system is the self. It is not some distinct part of us that rules the rest. The self is the system, and the system is the self. It is not some distinct part of us that rules the rest. So I think while Furman and Gila critiqued, and I certainly built upon what they've done in this book, to a large extent, I was really inspired by what they've done. But I think if you continue with the idea that there's a part of us, the I, that is a centre, that is somehow managing the rest, you maintain that sort of the problems of those dualisms. Whereas I just ran with Molly Young Brown's permission to sort of sweep it away. And I really love the idea that the self is the system. So if you think about like a murmuration of starlings in the sky, there's no centre. There's no one bird that's the boss bird that's telling everybody to keep up. It's a system where consciousness and will is there, but it's distributed throughout the flock. The consciousness or awareness is held in each individual bird, and the will is enacted by each individual bird by relating to the birds around it, not the whole flock, just their immediate experience. And then that, as a system as a whole, creates these beautiful aerial ballets. And then analogously, we can talk about the body, which is what Molly Young Brown does there. Analogously, a subsystem may specialise to perform needed functions, but we could hardly say the nervous system is the boss of the body. We used to maybe think that the brain was the centre of consciousness, the seat of consciousness. Maybe other cultures thought it was the heart, but I mean, these days we're recognising that there is a sort of consciousness. There's neurons throughout the body, in the gut. There's more neurons in your gut than in your brain, apparently. So, and that decenters the body. I mean, you don't need to think about a system. You don't need to think about psychosynthesis as having a centre. And I think what that does is frees up all these problems about duality and being clear and stepping back. We're always in experience, and that part of that comes from us, but also we're responding to the world and other people. That's where we're going in chapter 4, how to think about psychosynthesis in a much more networked, decentered way with imagination.
So the principle that leads on to that, well, all of these principles do, but so this perspectival principle. So just to finish on that, I mean, Assagioli says, he also says that the opposite of what we've just quoted on. So we've given him a little bit of a hard time by quoting how harsh he is about these objective observations from a detached impersonal observation. But he also says the self is not only an observer but also a will-er. And elsewhere he also says observation has to be followed by valuation. Science, particularly psychological science, cannot avoid valuation. So basically what he's talking about there is observations bring values. It's not like there's just data and you measure it like a barcode scanner in the supermarket. That's not how we experience the world. It's like we're not a neutral measuring machine like a barcode scanner. We don't measure objectively with a detached distance. Quite the opposite. And I would argue that you don't want to have that. You want to measure. You want to be really up close to your experience and in touch with the values that you're bringing. And which is the difference between us and AI.
Exactly. We're going to have to talk about AI. I was thinking about that. So, but there's a third one. Just to finish it, the third sub principle is emergence. And emergence is actually a word that I was exposed to quite a bit in my psychosynthesis training, because we talk a lot in psychosynthesis about emerging purpose. Which is a lovely idea, that the symptoms that people experience are not necessarily like problems to be solved to return them to how they were before they had the symptoms. You can also think about symptoms as like a difficult birthing process and indicative of something that's trying to emerge. Now, Assagioli doesn't use the word emerge or emergence because it didn't exist back in the day when he was writing, or he certainly didn't come across it. Emergence comes from systems theory, and it is what happens when all the different elements in the system come together, something new emerges. And the simple example to explain that is you're in the Atlantic Ocean on your little raft, and it's really calm and sunny and tranquil. And then in the distance you see the dark clouds forming, and then the wind starts to pick up, gets a bit more humid, the temperature drops, waves start to come in, and before you know it, you're in an Atlantic storm. And that Atlantic storm has arisen, has emerged from these different climatic conditions coming together. So they talk about like a perfect storm. There's a movie even called The Perfect Storm, where the maximal conditions come together and this massive storm. But the point is that nobody has created that storm. No like control center in Washington has engineered the storm. The storm or any event that's emerged from a system has a self-organizing nature that is facilitated by the synthesis of the different elements. And you can't say which element it was, if indeed it was one element that made the difference. So psychologically, for example, you're having a nervous breakdown. You don't know if that's being caused by losing your job, or what are the facts? Your wife leaving you, or the addiction that you've been experiencing for the last 10 years, or the rubbish diet that you've been eating for the last 100 years. I mean, there's all sorts of elements that come together to create our psychological experience, and sometimes that pushes us over the edge, and we have psychological symptoms. And so that speaks to synthesis and experience. But the scientific observer, the purpose of the observations that they're making is in order to control the world.
Yeah. Something occurred to me while I was reading that chapter. It's interesting you use the storm analogy. I've got a book somewhere. Where is that? It's so system science. There's a whole. Yes, there's a.
You've got a whole shelf on that.
There's a whole tangent over there on system science, but systems science developed a lot within kind of military context, military and government context, because of the desire for control of complex systems. And it's just interesting that what I kind of thought about is that there's system science. And in your book, you talk, there's system science, there's chaos theory, complexity theory, all these development of theory over the 20th and 21st century. You can see that as being driven by this repeated thwarting of attempts to control. So there were assumptions that system science could be a mechanism, it could be a system of control. It didn't work. There was blowback. There were unexpected things. So then the theory gets moved on, and then chaos theory happens, complexity theory happens, and then again there's an attempt to use it as a system of control, but
it keeps eluding them.
Yes, but the dream. It's this dream.
That's the dream of a science.
The dream of science, which goes back to Comte. Is his name Comte? Oh God, not the cheese. It's a French, seen as the founder of sociology. Had that systems. He definitely had. He kind of almost founded that dream, in a way. So I like the dream of science kind of approach because
that's the dreamlike thing, because the people in Psychosynthesis Sessions talks about when you disidentify, you're able to dominate and control your experience.
Again, a
and
very
that's
stark phrase. Yeah.
dominates quite strong, controls quite strong, and also again in the book, there's another side to Assagioli, and he does elsewhere qualify what he means
Yeah.
by control, which I've already written about
Mm.
earlier in the book when I talk about the disidentification exercise. But he does soften it, and he does say it's not really about out and out control. It's more about guiding or being able to
Yeah.
direct your experience. So again, you could draw upon the influence of empirical science and the idea of control. A, if you understood it was a metaphor, and B, if you didn't take it literally, and recognize that we have a sense of some control that comes in sometimes. But the danger of missing out on the influence of the influence, if you like, is that we just look for control, and we take it quite literally, that we can be in control, that we should be in control. We feel shame that we're out of control. We spend a lot of time trying to regain control, all of which is like missing out on the fact that there's a process that we could just align ourselves with that's trying to happen, that we're not in control of, that we can't completely understand, and yet that we can perhaps learn to facilitate. We don't know where it's going to go. So I think, two brief things to finish on. I think is psychosynthesis a science, needs to be treated with carefully. Depends what you mean by a science. And lastly, we always need to be careful and conscious of the influences that we're bringing to psychosynthesis. Of course, we'll never be able to clearly and definitively translate any given influence into a pure psychosynthesis theory, because there's no such thing. And this is just one suggestion for how to do that, to think about these sub-principles. There will be other ways to do that. But I just wanted to start the conversation within the psychosynthesis community to try and at least get some consciousness going around what it is that we're doing, so that, we can build from there. And also it's an antidote. One last point, and then I'll shut up. Also, it's an antidote to the criticism that psychosynthesis sometimes gets, and also the criticism that's sometimes internalized by psychosynthesis psychotherapists, that it's too open, that it has no limits, and that it's always pulling in all these different things like a magpie. I think if you get clear on the principles of what you're doing with all these influences, then not having limits is a good thing, because we want to be open to drawing from these resources, these new influences, to help us understand and work with psychosynthesis ever more clearly. That seems to be the only smart way to go forwards, rather than thinking, we need to, this is what psychosynthesis is, these are proper psychosynthesis practices, what you're doing isn't psychosynthesis. But it might well be psychosynthesis.
Yeah. I mean, in some ways, I think that's and then we touched on this maybe in the last episode, where my impression of reading your book is that there's a potential here, or there's something being offered which is broader than psychosynthesis, as conceived as a theoretical framework. Obviously I know that, but by doing so, by treating it as an epistemology, really, more than as a firm set of theory, like a way of approaching truth, a way of approaching knowledge, it then becomes available to everyone. I mean, definitely, I think across psychotherapy, that, and even on that basis of how do integrative therapists bring stuff together, bring influences together. There's something being offered there beyond psychosynthesis, I think. But also, I just wanted to kind of, again, because I know again, those quotes of Assagioli that may have, presented a bit of a harsh view, and but I think what you're doing is really important in by drawing attention to those and actually, bringing out those principial kind of aspects of Assagioli's theory, because these stand out to the modern eye. These phrases, we can dominate and control everything from which we are disidentify, stands out to the modern eye, and people, and I've had students that kind of go, okay, I don't want that, and kind of end up throwing the baby out with the bathwater. So I've had a common pitfall, I think, in student essays I find is this conflation of disidentification as a process with disidentification as technique,
Yes.
thing. And often there's underneath that, like, students intuitively reject this old way of looking at things, this the object subject. They intuitively reject that, and in so doing kind of reject the kind of, as you say, the principial kind of value in what you're trying to bring out. So that, I think it's really valuable.
And miss out on the other things that Assagioli said that's actually...
Exactly. Yeah, but you're highlighting those and putting those things in context. So I think hopefully it's not that these critiques are, going to alienate people from psychosynthesis. They're going to actually kind of go, oh, actually, yes, I can see the principle, and I understand the context of what those phrases that we've pulled out, whatever.
Exactly. We need to build on the past, and you can't just invent things fresh. And we need to do something with it in the context that we find ourselves in, which is creative but also a little bit destructive. If we're just ossifying things from the past without adapting them to the situation that we find ourselves in, then that's not what we're about. That's not what psychosynthesis is. It's a living tradition. But I think you put it really well. That's probably a nice place to end. That rounds things off really nicely.
Cool. Yes.
So next time on the Psychosynthesis Sessions with Allan and Ryan, we will be looking at chapter 4 of the Active Imagination, which is the chapter on imaginings, which we've touched on in this episode. So an image-based approach to psychosynthesis, looking at how Assagioli wrote about imagination, and what he said about why imagination is important, and then I go forwards to sort of release it, as it were, from the assumptions that we've spoken about in this episode, which is like the assumptions of an empirical science. So tune in for that, and in the meantime, give us a 5-star review, do comment, do share the podcast,
and do buy the book.
Oh yeah, well, I'll let you say that. And thank you, Ryan. And just spread the podcast around, and we'll make the world a little better, one podcast episode at a time. Thank you, dear listener. Thank you, Ryan.
Thank you, Alan. Okay, see you next time.